the introducer tonight. Ned Olmsted's fascination with geography has been with him all of his life, and so travel for him has long been an essential. After college, he felt the tug of places on this earth that would not be at the top of most people's travel lists, places like Afghanistan and Newfoundland being two examples. In the 1970s, when the Peace Corps needed instructors in Afghanistan to teach English language skills, Ned volunteered. He spent a year there. When the Quebec-Labrador Foundation believed that drownings could be reduced in Newfoundland by teaching young Newfoundlanders how to sail small boats in rough coastal waters, and they needed experienced sailors to do the teaching, again, Ned volunteered. Yet the Newfoundlanders already knew something that the Quebec-Labrador Foundation didn't. One of the best ways to avoid more drownings was to not sail small boats in rough coastal water. In their view, anyone who did so had to be either a suicide risk or an outright lunatic. He remained ashore that year for more than he had anticipated he would be, and so it is in part due to the Newfoundlanders' well-earned respect for their coastal waters that Ned is here with us tonight. His teaching career in high schools and colleges goes back to the late 1970s and has included many summers spent as a team leader with the Student Conservation Corps repairing portions of the Appalachian Trail and the Long Trail. Ned has climbed mountains from the Andes to the Scottish Highlands, and he knows the trails threaded through the gravel and granite of New Hampshire's Presidential Range like the veins on the back of his hand. He can scramble over boulders and scree with the agility and speed of a Rocky Mountain goat. He can cook a mouth-watering gourmet meal on a single-burner camp stove to rival anything served in the best restaurant, and he can sail a boat through the network of islands of Canada's Georgian Bay with masterly skill. In the 25 years he has taught writing and literature at Landmark College, he has shared his own passions for the natural world through reading and writing and through authentic contact with that world, leading Landmark students on excursions as close as Black Mountain and the Pinnacle and as distant as the Sonoran Desert. He is most himself when he is outside, and he is even more himself when he can combine strenuous physical exercise in a natural setting with his love for teaching about the out of doors. When these conditions are met in a place of natural beauty and special meaning, Ned Olmsted is very happy. There are other things that make him happy. A few summers ago, I was lugging camping gear from a lake shore to the back of his truck. After hauling a load, I turned back to the lake where I reasonably expected he would be waiting for me at one end of a canoe. But long before I got to the lake, I encountered him coming up the trail with the full-size canoe on his back. Rob Gunther Moore saw my alarmed expression and whispered out of Ned's earshot, "Let him do it. He has to do it himself." "Okay," I said. The deep joy that he derives from carrying full-size canoes long distances on his back may be to some no less mystifying than his nostalgia for the French and Indian War, but both reflect his abiding preference for the 18th century over the 21st century, and as such merit a certain measure of respect. His passion for reading equals only his passion for contact with nature. Yet John Muir once famously said that we must remember that books are not ends in themselves, but only pointers to the woods and to the mountains. This conviction is at the heart of all he teaches. His teaching began as all teaching does, with independent learning, and teaching himself how to use a map and a compass began early. I'm about to quote from the 7th edition of the Boy Scout Handbook, 43 years old. This is mine. Ned Olmsted has uncharacteristically lost his. This is a fact I'm a little perturbed by, but we'll leave that. Anyway, to earn the rank of second class in the Boy Scouts when he was 11 or 12, he had to prove he could do the following. Quote, Identify on a topographic map at least 10 different map symbols, including contour lines. Explain how a compass works. Give its 8 principal points. Set a compass and use it to read at least 3 bearings in degrees. Show how to orient a map. Use a map, preferably a topographic map, and a compass to follow far enough to prove your ability, a route indicated on the map. Anyone who has ever been captivated by the movement of a compass needle and the allure of contour lines can understand the delight a young boy who loved the outdoors might feel upon reading those sentences for the first time. For him, they help spark an enthusiasm that has never gone away. I used the word nostalgia a few moments ago, but I was only half serious. There is a thin line between nostalgia and what truly matters, and for Ned, it has always been about what truly matters. What truly matters to him should truly matter to everyone who cares about this earth, whose places big and small, near and remote, are represented through maps, those that we carry in our backpacks as well as those we carry in our memories and in our imaginations. So, Ned Olmsted.
That introduction, as I knew it would, makes all of the anxiety and the preparation for this evening's talk worth it. And you're a good friend, and I thank you for sharing all of that. This evening's talk really boils down to a deceptively simple set of questions. Would we prefer to be told where we are, or would we rather try to figure it out for ourselves? Now, it's very possible that I may come across as a bit of a techno-curmudgeon as I talk about my relationship with maps, but ultimately this presentation isn't so much about nostalgia for pre-digital cartography or warnings against GPS dependence, as it is about roaming on the land and how maps can help us tell stories about the places we love. There are slides this evening, and I'm going to get to them in a bit. It's entirely likely that I'm going to get out of sync with my slides and my presentation. So if something sits up there for half an hour, throw something at me, and I'll try to remember to move along. I can tell you a little anecdote about sort of where all this began, or at least recently anyway. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I took my nature writing class up Black Mountain to do some journal writing. And while I was pointing out distant landmarks, one of my students began to tell me about an experience that he and his roommate had had over the weekend. They'd gone off-roading in what he termed really wild mountains somewhere to the north. And I was curious about the really wild mountains part and queried where they'd traveled specifically. His response was a little vague. As we were standing in Vermont looking out over New Hampshire, I thought it likely that they'd ended up in one state or the other. But again, he wasn't sure. I then asked him how he'd found out about this off-road destination in the first place, and he exclaimed that he'd Googled off-roading in New England, located a spot designated as such, entered the coordinates into his SUV's GPS, and headed out. Well, I wondered how long they'd driven or what they'd observed along the way. Still not much information was forthcoming. So I gave it one last shot and asked if he could physically describe the terrain where they'd ended up. The lone detail that stood out in his memory was a cluster of abandoned Cold War-era radar domes scattered along a ridge. And immediately I knew where they'd been. They'd followed their GPS heading, seemingly blindly, for 3.5 hours north, cut swaths through the hillsides, then turned around and made their way back home on a reverse heading. They'd had a great time, gone exploring, and returned to tell me their tale. But I was perplexed. How had the journey itself figured into their experience. And the whole off-road thing seemed an ironic misnomer. It was at that point that I began to worry. I come from a long line of Connecticut Yankees who tended to eye the acquisition of technological gadgetry as indulgent and unnecessary. If something worked with proven utility and functionality, you didn't swap it out for the newest model. A GPS probably would have been a hard sell. On the other hand, my father, and my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, all of whom were civil engineers, valued the kind of precision which instrumentation could provide, especially when it came to measuring the land. They could triangulate from a fixed point using trigonometry, a transit, and a plumb line. They laid out roads, corrected boundaries, drew scale maps of an increasingly industrialized New England landscape. I inherited none of their mathematical acumen, and to this day remain somewhat fearful of machines which require the use of numbers. When my father attempted to teach me how to read a topographical map, to master the abstraction of representational, configurational, directional correspondence, he was calling upon a set of skills which, since the Enlightenment, has supported the belief that reason, logic, and mathematical exactitude will unlock the mysteries of the universe. Needless to say, I didn't get it. Instead, what captured my imagination were the intriguing place names and the veined networks of light blue scratches which I surmised to be brooks and rivers, the seemingly random splotches of green and brown and white, the meandering patterns of concentric lines. I was first drawn to maps on an aesthetic and emotional level. I knew that there were exciting stories to be gleaned from them. As a child, I was very serious about exploration. All right. Perhaps I never had enough sense to be afraid of getting lost. But somehow I knew that if I wandered around the corner, I was pretty certain I could remember how to retrace my steps. All it ever took was for me to go there once, and I could count on finding my way back again. As I began to play around with map reading, the thing which proved most satisfying was the aha moment I got from consulting a map after I'd gone on an adventure. On the map, I'd retrace the route that I'd taken on the ground, and in doing so, details and interconnections would reveal themselves with the kind of big picture clarity I experienced when I manipulated into place that last jigsaw puzzle piece on my wooden map of the United States. Annie Dillard has said, when everything else has gone from my brain, the state capitals, the neighborhoods where I lived, then my own name, and then finally the faces of my family, when all this is dissolved, what will be left, I believe, is topography. The dreaming memory of land as it lay this way and that. Maps always were just plain fun for me. I liked opening up an atlas, taking in at a glance a bird's eye view of Easter Island west across the Pacific to the Straits of Malacca, or to run my palm over the three-dimensional goosebumps of a relief map, or spin a globe on its axis, or practice refolding the map that came slotted inside every month's edition of National Geographic, making sure never to force a crease. That's one of my favorite things in class is when I give maps to my students and then watch them try to refold them again. Nicolas Bouvier, in his book Le Usage du Monde, notes, "It is the silent contemplation of atlases flat on one's stomach on the rug between the ages of 10 and 13 that makes one want to leave everything behind." The 1911 N.C. Wyeth illustrated edition of Treasure Island was one of my prized possessions. And I was certain that Robert Louis Stevenson's own treasure map in his original 1883 edition of the book was the real deal. Simon Garfield, in his book On the Map, writes that Stevenson loved not only treasure maps, but maps in general. He liked the idea of a map, the feel of its folds in his hands. He liked the naming of maps and the fact that a map could get you home, but also get you lost. Stevenson is quoted as saying, "I'm told there are people who do not care for maps, and I find it hard to believe." Others of my favorite books contained evocative maps which sent me into rapture. So let's see if we can name some of these. Okay, what's this? What book?
Chronicles of Narnia.
Okay, Tales of Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia, rather. This one you probably won't know. It's called Swallows and Amazons. It's a British series of sort of adventure stories. Angelica, what's this one? Yeah, all right. The 100-Acre Wood. Classic. Huckleberry Finn, right. And especially The Hobbit. Okay. You know this one?
Oh, right, Leanne and Andy?
No. The Wild Wood is maybe the only. This is The Wind in the Willows. Okay. I have to interject here a slightly modified version of my favorite quote, which sort of goes like this. "Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about with maps." Except it's not maps. What is it? Boats. Boats. And that's a toss-up. For me, I could go either way. The number of hours I spent in my lifetime daydreaming about boats, maps, shocking. In many of these stories, the dominant theme is journeying and sometimes losing the way. About one of my heroes, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, it's been said that he was a man who found himself by getting lost. Even school couldn't dampen my enthusiasm for maps. Remember these? Okay. I didn't see a whole lot of A+ in my elementary and middle school years, but put a blank map of Russia in front of me, and I could pencil in the Urals and nail the Crimean Peninsula every time. If we were studying the raid on Deerfield or the French and Indian War, Daniel Boone, Lewis and Clark, I wanted a map close at hand to give me an image of the lay of the land. It wasn't enough to read in my textbook about the obstacles these hardy souls faced. I needed to know which side of Lake Champlain Rogers Rangers canoed down on their way to burn the villages of the St. Francis Indians. The maps of early cartographers and explorers fascinated me. Got me thinking about the exotic far away. Marco Polo riding a Bactrian camel on the Silk Road, Magellan navigating through the straits which bear his name, the Vikings crossing to Vinland, the Berber traveler Ibn Battuta heading off on Hajj to Mecca and coming home 24 years later. By the time I was in 5th grade, I couldn't read a book unless I had within easy reach an associated map which I could consult should a geography question arise. I'd become a bit like a character in one of Jim Harrison's novels. Martin was a map nut and believed that you couldn't understand events unless you located them geographically. When I was 9, I began climbing mountains in Vermont with my father. He did most of the real planning, but the night before a hike, he'd pull out his dog-eared copy of the Green Mountain Club guide and show me the route he'd chosen. A special attraction to these climbs was scouting for the bronze Coast and Geodetic Survey marker set into a granite ledge somewhere near the summit. Ever seen one of these? These benchmarks served as triangulation points in pre-satellite topographic cartography and belonged to the era of forest fire lookout towers and CCC trail crews. When we scaled Mount Washington in the summer that I was 12 and looked out at the spectacular above tree-line view, my father rattled off the names of all the distant peaks poking through the blue haze at every cardinal point. He always packed a compass, just in case a cloud dropped on us. But I don't remember him using it. I think it was then that I had my first inkling that it's possible for one not only to develop a facile map memory, but to acquire as well an almost biophilic understanding and affinity for a terrain based both on scientific knowledge and an intuitive compassion for how a landscape's topography sits upon it. My father was a geology major, and there were things on the land he could see which I could not. But slowly, the puzzle pieces were coming together for me. This was my grandfather's World War I standard issue compass. And I have a contemporary and actually very emotional story attached to it, which I'm not going to share with you. My point is that I wonder in another 25, 30 years whether someone might hold up a handheld GPS unit and wax sentimentally about it. Possibly. I don't know the answer. Of the many cartographic manifestations maps can take, topography has held the greatest attraction for me over the years. Hard to tell where this is. Can anybody take a guess as to what this map shows? That's not terribly clear. This is Mount Washington. And then you go Mount Jefferson, Mount Adams, Mount Madison. This was the basis of some of my earliest and still some of my best memories of geography and maps. Dan and I have been there. The ability of a series of contour intervals and colored shadings etched upon a 17 by 21 inch sheet of map to convey intimate landscape mysteries is indeed wondrous. Any given quadrangle might portray a cliff face's spectacular sheerness or bathtub-like water pockets hidden deep within a slick rock canyon, roads which dead end before reaching their logical destination, lines of sight into the next watershed, a once open pasture now grown to black birch and white pine, cellar holes, cemeteries, and covered bridges, not to mention exotic symbols for things like lava fields, lighthouses, mangrove swamps, oil derricks, and standing stones. When I first discovered British ordnance maps, this is actually Ordnance Survey of Ireland map of standing stones at Loch Rue, but when I first unfolded a British Ordnance map and realized that all this time I'd been looking at American USGS maps, the comparison was like moving to a whole nother level. USGS maps look like about as interesting as reading a brown paper bag compared to British maps. Topographic maps can never replicate the ground itself. The wonder is the land, not its representation on paper or a screen. But maps, along with oral tradition, have been helping humans codify their most important narratives for millennia. Robert Macfarlane, in his book, The Wild Places, tells us that in Bedellina, on the Lombardy plain of Italy, one of the oldest written maps of the world exists. A complex petroglyph, clearly topographical in nature, incised upon an angled boulder whose surface had been smoothed by the retreat of the glaciers to make an ideal writing sheet. It shows human figures, animals, settlements, dwellings, paths, both zigzag for uphill and straight along the flat. The map is palimpsestic in nature. The first markings are thought to have been made in the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. And the most recent, the houses, during the Iron Age, around 900 BC. The map is vast, extending 15 feet wide but over 7 feet high. Wendell Berry admonishes us to rediscover what it means to be landed. Not in the traditional sense of owning land, but in the sense of being connected to a home landscape by learning and sharing the narratives of the places we inhabit. When we overlay our imagination onto the geography of a map, the stories already implicit there perhaps stand out in bolder relief as we imbue the landscape with our own hopes and dreams. Obviously, this can be dangerous. A lot of postmodern discourse on maps, rightfully so, rails against their potential to perpetuate neo-colonial bias and bigotry. But I digress. Let's get back to the simpler joys that most of us have the capacity to experience from all sorts of maps. There's a sense of community to be had from sharing maps with others. From teaching map and compass skills and witnessing students begin to understand the relational correspondence between the world and the map. There's some interesting contrast here of Black Mountain or the English countryside. Breathtaking craftsmanship and artistry can be embedded in or derived from maps. This is an extraordinarily detailed hand-drawn map by an Englishman named Tim Robinson of part of the Connemara coast in Ireland that's so remarkably detailed that even stone walls show up on this map. And the Irish place names are noted with great detail. It's one of the greatest map makers living today, in my opinion. This map is called Imagining This Place, and it's I think a kind of an intersection of a view that, anyway, you can see the upper right-hand corner, just barely, what's called a catastrophic view, a bird's eye view, looking down, interwoven or mingled or melded with a landscape perspective. And kind of the idea of imagining those two different perspectives. Or this one. Some of you may recognize this. This is called Downtown Brattleboro Tax Sale by Christine Greeley, former Landmark faculty member. A really beautiful, evocative piece. This is a volumetric topographic map by Maya Lin, who did the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C. And the idea here is to allow visitors to actually walk. These are about human height, to walk in between these topographic folds, to have the sensation of almost geologically being within the earth. There can be speciality in maps. Geomorphological processes in the Principality of Liechtenstein. Okay. Or a phrenological map of the brain. Anybody know what phrenology was the study of? Andrew, say it.
Well, they thought that parts of your head that correspond with your intelligence based on the shape of the brain.
Yeah. In the mid to early 1800s. And it was obviously completely debunked as a science. But there's a, come on here. Oh, it's not going to work. There's a quadrant just above the eye called locality. So perhaps there was some thinking that there might be a bump that had something to do with our ability to store navigational geographic information. But where do we know today the brain holds that set of information? Navigational, directional, map memory, if you want to call it. Where is that? Come on, some of you know this. I know you know it. What part of the brain? It's a famous story, a study about the London taxi cab drivers. It's not ringing a bell? All right, that's all right. In the hippocampus. Hippocampus is where we store directional information. And there was a wonderful study done a number of years ago where brain scans of London taxi cab drivers were imaged. And turned out that their hippocampus were inordinately, comparatively speaking, very, very large. To be licensed, to get a hack license in London as a taxi cab driver takes about 3 years of learning intricate routes, and it's a process that actually most people fail at. And this longitudinal study looked at their brain capacity for that sort of information, and showed that their hippocampus could get larger and larger and larger the more they studied and worked on remembering route finding. How do you guys route find, other than using a GPS? Are there multiple ways to do it?
Boston,
Yeah.
major intersections,
Yeah.
all the roads go
Yeah.
to other major
Yeah.
squares.
Okay. And do you know the names of at least some of those roads?
Well, I don't necessarily know the names of the roads, but I know if I head on this way.
Okay. All right. What are some other ways?
Basic using the sun and knowing your north.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So having a sense of north, south, east, and west. In my family, there's an ongoing kind of dispute where I remember how to get from point A to point B by the big tree that grows next to the barn with the red silo. And then at the community garden, you take a left. And okay, and partly that has to do, I think, with my innate fear of numbers. I can't remember route numbers. And I can't remember names of roads terribly well. But as I said earlier, all it took was for me to go there once, and 40 years later, I could take you back there again. My wife, on the other hand, remembers her way with numbers, details, routes, mileage, those kinds of hard facts. And so it does lead to sometimes some conflict of who's going to navigate and who's going to drive. But there are lots of ways to kind of store and process and remember locality. There's no one right way to do it. But this research seems to indicate, contrary to the belief that a lot of people have, that all of us have the capacity to store navigational information in our brains. Now, as contrary as that may feel to some of us. I had an aunt who couldn't find her way out of a paper bag and claimed that there was no way she would ever be able to learn how to, basically get herself home from church even. But that's been debunked. Again, I digress. This is a speciality. This is a map of a Segway tour of San Diego. So, should you ever want to take a Segway tour of San Diego, a map exists for that purpose. This is a Ushahidi map of Japanese tsunami crisis centers that popped up after the 2011 tsunami. Do you guys know anything about Ushahidi maps? Crowdsourced maps?
Yes.
No? Ames, what's a crowdsourced map?
Well, it's a map where there might be a certain theme, and people are given the way to add information to the map so it becomes one giant effort.
Right. That was very succinct. It's a platform, and it's open to many different channels. You can email to it, you can tweet to it. And it first started being used actually in Kenya during Kenyan elections for people to report in on election abuses. It also cropped up during the crisis in Japan. And these are all crisis centers that were taking in people, receiving information, but it was crowdsourced. It was live on the ground information. Pretty extraordinary.
They also use it in now, police, in Oakland, they do, they've done
Yeah.
ways to, police sourcing, if you see robbery or something, or
Right.
Crime statistics.
crime
Yeah. Its greatest application still seems to be in crisis management, but law enforcement uses it. Yeah. Some maps are more about social commentary. Ames sent me this one. It's the United States redrawn, 50 states of equal population. Talk about redistricting. Some wonderful names here. Some of you have seen this one before in my classes. That perception that anything west of 10th Avenue in New York is in the hinterland. Okay.
There's a similar one made for Boston, too.
Yes. Dan and I were just talking about that the other day. Anything west of 295 is out there in sort of New York State or Colorado or somewhere. Okay. Some of you have seen this one too. This is New Yorkistan. A very famous New Yorker cover. Politically incorrect, a melange of commentary perhaps on the 5 boroughs and the ethnicity and idiosyncrasies of New Yorkers, but also on a little bit of xenophobia. Some great names here. Or just plain humor. Or some political satire. and I hope this doesn't offend anyone. In 2009, when I began jotting down my thoughts about maps during a sabbatical, there were relatively few current books on maps geared towards the general reading public. And since then, 4 have come out which extol the amateur's passion for all things maps. Some of them are up on the display there. And I have to say that the authors, without my permission, shamelessly borrowed some of my best ideas. So, as I continue to explore these 2 worlds, okay, you see the contrast, I think. As I continue to explore these 2 worlds, I'm left with numerous questions to which I don't have many clear answers. And I think what I'd like to do now is share some of my questions with you, let you hear them, and then perhaps we can bat some of them around before the evening's over. What do we get out of our encounters with maps today? What is map knowledge, and how does one acquire it? Does it need to be continually exercised? Is it a bioevolutionary vestige that's on its way out? Is it transferable to other modes of inquiry? Is it still valuable in the digital age? Is map knowledge still valuable in the digital age? What are the possible consequences of our becoming utterly dependent on global positioning systems to navigate our way through life? By design, the intent of many maps is to allay our anxieties about venturing into the unknown. Do GPS maps help us confront our fears any better than do other kinds of maps? Or on the contrary, do they marginalize the self-confidence we derive from being lost and then finding our way? Do old-fashioned flat maps encourage the mind to reject pure linear logic and play with imperfection, randomness, and free association in ways that digital maps may not? This is more of a theory than a question. As I've stated, I believe maps can stimulate both wandering and wondering in our imaginations. But perhaps more significantly, they may play a literal role in helping us protect and preserve access to the land. As long as we continue to lovingly map landscapes and use those maps to help give voice to our appreciation for a terrain, especially unbuilt ones, by actually walking on it, we validate and further the argument that public access to open land is an inalienable right of the citizenry. Do Google Maps narrow our perception of a landscape? Do they blunt navigational decision-making based on intuition, deductive reasoning, and geographic memory? Do they take the mystery out of what's off the edge of the map? Do they imply that the terrain which lies in the verges between major roads, shaded that vacuous Google green, should be dismissed as irrelevant no man's land? Do they promote a kind of GPS myopia? Do they invade the silence of maps? I've got lots more questions, but I think I'll leave it at that. A fear that I've had since I began this research is that my observations will be dismissed as nostalgia for a slower, more intimate mode of moving across the land. And in trying to reach an audience increasingly comprised of digital natives who may possess little or no basis upon which to juxtapose these 2 worlds, that I'm swimming against the current of digital ubiquity. It's difficult to know how to broach the sense of loss that I feel for the passing of foldable maps from our culture. But I hold to the conviction that if we stop dreaming through maps and let the wonderment they can evoke be replaced by pure navigational efficiency, our relationships with real places will atrophy and their true identities will be lost to us. Robert Macfarlane says the same thing, but much more eloquently. He says, we cannot navigate and place ourselves only with maps that make the landscape dream-proof, impervious to the imagination. Such maps encourage the elimination of wonder from our relationship with the world. And once wonder has been erased from our thinking about the land, then we are lost. So that's fairly deep. I think I'd like to end with a little silliness.
With the presidential election only 12 days away, here is our own Fred Armisen to show us how things are shaping up in voting districts all around the country. He'll be using our new Weekend Update Megapixel Giant Touch Map.
Okay, let's get right to the mega map. Great. Okay, one thing we're going to look at is we're going to want to look at Pennsylvania. Let's have a look at that. Have a really good look at Harrisburg. Getting really close to that. Fantastic. Let's go back a little bit. Back a little bit more. Back a little bit more. And let's go over to Idaho. Let's take a look at that. Let's take a really close look at it. Really, really close. Really, really close. Excellent. Let's go back to that. Actually, move up and down. Also, don't forget, you can also shrink it so you put it in your pocket if you need. Okay. Let's look at some of the states here. Remember, you can always change some of the colors. And, of course, if you want to make something out of green, we've got a little face here, whiskers. We can make a cat. A big triangle nose. And that. Okay, let's go back to the other map. Excellent. Okay, let's look at Ohio. Let's look really close. Let's look at the Cleveland area. Let's get it really close. Really, really close. Move it over. You can see the top of a warehouse. We're really going to want to look at that. Very, very important. We're really going to want to look at that. Okay, now let's take a little bit of Oregon. Let's move it out to the ocean. To be surrounded by water, that's very, very dangerous. Let's take Minnesota. Let's put it right over Virginia. Minnesota is very heavy. Imagine the sheer weight of it. Here's New York right there. New York was there in 2004 as well. And we can shake it around like that.
Sorry, Fred, what are you showing us exactly? It seems like you just got this thing and just want to play around with it.
Actually, what I'm doing is very important and informational.
Well, it's a really expensive piece of equipment, Fred, and I kind of feel like you're wasting our time.
Right. Where are you from exactly?
I'm from New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. What a pretty state. Wouldn't it be a drag if we pulled it over to Mexico?
Fred, come on, stop moving around.
Oh.
Don't do that.
Come on, Fred, put those stakes back where they belong. Cheaper oil, a strong dollar, and looser credit. The stock market tumbled yet again yesterday, Triv.
All right. So if you can't have fun with maps and be a little silly with maps, then I don't know that there's much point. That's really probably my parting message to you. So I think what I'd like to do is maybe field just a couple questions. I know many of you have a long night ahead of you still and want to get up the hill, but I'd like to field a couple of questions, and then if anybody would like to stay a little bit later and pick my brains a little bit more or take a look at some of the things I've got down here, I'd be thrilled. So, questions? Ilana?
Speakers make like, if they have a similar area, they'll put in a fake town or a fake river or something to make it denoted as a separate map or area. Like, so like, I don't know if this is true. This is something that I've heard. Are you aware of this? Is this complete, like...
I'm not sure I follow. On a GPS?
No, on, like, maps, like, paper maps.
Yeah.
So, like, if they're doing a similar area, and it's just, like, you're drawing it out to denote that it's, like, a copy of a map. It would be put in, like, a small town or, like, a small something to denote if it would be copied over and you know a fake map.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, yes. There's a name for those. They're telltale marks. Right. That's done. Yeah, I don't know too much more about it though, but I know I've read about that. Other questions? Anybody? Leslie?
I just wondered if you like flying in planes and looking down at the topography from above. It always sort of feels like a map when you're looking down.
It reminds me a little bit, again, of Robert Louis Stevenson's Counterpane. And yeah, the network, the patchwork of, well, they used to be rectangles. Now they're concentrics. They're irrigation circles. But yeah. I still like looking out the window, but I'm too far away from it. Tom.
Could you not criticize maps as in the same way you could criticize GPS systems? In other words, both you can rely on too much. Can't you use a map to interfere with your natural ability to orientate yourself in a landscape and only be able to get to somewhere because you have to find it on a map? And do you see a difference in that reliance on maps versus reliance on GPS?
My personal feeling is that a GPS or Google map undercuts some of that inferential thinking, in that when you have a flat map that clearly has a boundary and you can go off the map and there are edges to it, there's only so much information that can be contained. And with a Google map, there are no boundaries, there are no edges. You can scroll north, south, east, west to your heart's content. And I think that's alluring. I think there's a real kind of appeal to that that may erode that sense of what I'm calling the silences of maps, the places where we just don't have all the answers, and we have to stop and figure it out. I take your point. I think that all maps are crutches in that way. But yeah, that's how I'd answer it.
A better crutch.
Yeah, so it's a little hard not to make value judgments here. I'm sorry.
You know, myself, I don't think of maps as a crutch.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you've known anybody who have used maps in a way that was like a GPS, where they couldn't get to some place unless they consulted a map.
Because the limitations of the GPS were such
No,
that...
no, just because, and before GPS, people using over-relying on maps, so the fact that they can't get to, let's say, Walpole by their nose. They don't know, they can't do it without a map. They have to look at a map and, in other words, and be caught in the artificiality of the map. That has an aesthetic to it, but that still might interfere with a sense of natural direction.
Right. Well, I think, personally, it takes a lifetime of practicing finding your way, whether it's in an urban context or whether it's in the woods of Vermont. You have to have a lot of experience with being on the ground. But I do think that those skills are transferable, and that if you don't have a map in front of you and you're in a new terrain you've never been in before, there's certain kinds of transferable knowledge bases that are applicable to help. I mean, we had to polish those skills bioevolutionarily for eons to stay alive. So they're still with us. Okay, I think I'll sort of end it at that point. I really appreciate students, particularly, your coming this evening. I know some of you here may be a little under duress, but nonetheless, I thank you. If anybody'd like to stick around for a few minutes, I'm more than happy. So thank you very much.